I'll start with an anecdote. Your bit about turning your cell phones off just made me think of something. First thing it did is make me reach in my pocket and turn my cell phone off. A couple of years ago, I'm known mostly for writing like crime thrillers, suspense type fiction, and every year there's a big industry convention called BoucherCon, which is named after an old critic named Anthony Boucher. And a couple of years ago I was asked to be the Toastmaster for BoucherCon. It's this big conference where readers and writers and publishing industry people all gather for a weekend. It's usually in a different city every year. So I was Toastmaster at BoucherCon, and the sort of the highlight night of BoucherCon is the Anthony Awards, which is a mystery award given out at BoucherCon every year. So I was doing my thing, and cell phones, we've always got them, so I've gotten into the habit of not wearing a watch, so I was using my cell phone as a clock. Normally, before the Anthony Awards occur, there's usually an in memoriam kind of a presentation where someone from the community who's passed away in the last year, and it's often somebody that everybody knows, and so it's kind of an emotional sort of moment at the Anthony Awards every year. Naturally, the Nebraska-Wisconsin game was happening at the same time, and so I'd asked my dad back in Lincoln, text me the score, because I won't be able to see the game. Of course, I left my phone unmuted at the podium when I left to bring up the In Memoriam Award, and naturally that was the moment, like during the emotional In Memoriam Award was when my phone started going off with Nebraska scores. So I learned my lesson, but it's nice to have a reminder from you about turning your phone off before going up to a podium. I am Sean Doolittle. I live in Council Bluffs. I'm from Nebraska. I grew up in a rural area just south of Lincoln. Towns of Roca, Hickman, Cortland, Firth. I went to Firth Norris High School, kindergarten through high school. Went to UNL for undergraduate and graduate work in English. Lived in Omaha for a decade plus, and have lived in Council Bluffs now for the past decade. As I and Bonnie's intro said, I write thrillers for the most part. I've published 6 novels, a bunch of short stories, have a new book coming out next year. I understand that there were some people in a class here reading from my most recent published novel, which is called Lake Country. So I thought I would start today's reading with just a little piece from Lake Country. I'll just read the first chapter. What I'm thinking is nobody wants to hear a solid hour of fiction read aloud. So I'll read a couple of things, we'll kind of look at the clock, maybe try to go for about 40 minutes and then leave some time for questions and answers at the end if anybody has any. But I'll start with Lake Country since I guess I don't know which class of yours was reading Lake Country, but I guess it was a class that got canceled. So maybe some of you have read Lake Country, maybe you haven't. There's a sort of a prologue to Lake Country that I'm going to skip over, and I'll just start with chapter 1. The stuff you would have learned in the prologue is that the main character of the book, Mike, is living in Minneapolis with his former combat buddy, Daryl. They were in the Second Gulf War together and are now back home, kind of getting through on menial jobs and living together in a kind of a rundown house in St. Paul. And that's where the book opens. So we'll start there. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Mike Barlow woke up from one of the old dreams. He'd been sighting down his rifle from the edge of a rooftop, unable to see the ground below. A hot wind blew in from the desert, obscuring his view. He could feel the tension mounting beneath his trigger finger. He couldn't make out his target in the void. The moment he fired, Mike bolted up in a clench of panic, heart hammering, unaware of his position. Then, little by little, the hollow, scouring sound of sand blowing against his helmet resolved itself into the soft patter of rain on the bedroom window. Gray daylight seeped in through the curtains. As his surroundings slowly came into focus, so did the real-world noise that had roused him. Somebody banging on the front door. Mike dragged in a rattling breath, dimly recalling the echo of distant artillery as the last of the dream fell away. He looked around and found himself on top of his own unmade covers, still in his clothes. He glanced at the clock beside the bed and saw that Wednesday morning had already come and gone. It was nearly 3 o'clock in the afternoon. A fresh barrage thudded through the walls while he sat there, still blinking away the fog. Mike hauled himself out of the rack and shambled down the hall in his stocking feet, thinking, all right already, don't break it down. He was halfway across the living room when the door fell silent, then thundered once in reply. Mike stopped in his tracks as the jamb splintered. For a moment, standing there frozen, watching the door burst inward on his hinges, he wondered if he was still dreaming after all. A guy Mike had never seen before came strolling into the house like he had an invitation. Mid-30s, dressed in jeans, a leather sport bike jacket, and lug boots. He was built low and lean, with a Kevlar bulge under a black nylon t-shirt, and a face that looked like it had been broken and healed wrong. Seeing Mike, the guy's eyes went hard. Got him, he yelled over his shoulder. Really? Another voice said from out on the stoop. A new face appeared in the doorway, and this one Mike recognized. The expression on his face changed from relieved to surprised to disappointed, all in a few seconds. Oh, crap, the newcomer said. Mike, sorry, man, we sort of thought nobody was home. Mike stood in his spot, flat-footed, still scrambling to assess the situation in front of him. He couldn't seem to untangle his reflexes. It occurred to him that if the dream had been real and he'd been back in the desert, he'd have had his ass shot off by now. Toby, he said. It came out like a croak. The first guy through the door rolled his eyes. Toby London shook rainwater from the sleeves of his windbreaker. He looked embarrassed. We tried knocking. Oh, Mike said. He realized the breath he'd been holding. He released the breath he'd been holding, still waiting for his pulse to settle. In that case, come on in. Mike wasn't a gambler, but he'd known a few bookies, and Toby London wasn't like any of them. He was a kid, for one thing, barely 20 years old, with bad eyes and thin bones and a complexion like pancake batter. If the stories Mike had heard about Toby were true, Toby started up his first sports book as a sophomore in high school. By the time he was a senior, he had faculty from across the public school district on his weekly bottom sheet. Toby's facility with numbers was said to be such that he pulled straight D's in math class, yet he'd been able to pay cash for a restored '64 Shelby Cobra on graduation day, the same car he'd supposedly driven into an overpass at Butman on graduation night. Even if those stories weren't true, they summed up Mike's impression of Toby London well enough. A young guy with big ideas and all the smarts he needed to get himself more horsepower than he knew what to do with. I can get a guy to fix that, he told Mike, nodding at the busted door frame as he stepped through. He dried his shoes politely on the crusty bath towel laid down as a mat in the entryway. He took a look around and said, "Did we get you out of bed?" "That's okay," Mike said. "I had to get up to answer the door anyway." The guy with the brutal face and the ballistic undershirt seemed impatient. "Where's your roommate?" he said. Mike looked at him. The guy looked back. "I didn't get your name," Mike said. "You don't want it." "That's Bryce," Toby jumped in. He turned to his man and said, "Mike's okay." "Hey, what a relief." Bryce watched Mike, but spoke to Toby. Future reference, you could have mentioned there might be two in the house. "Sorry." Mike waited. "So, yeah," Toby said. He looked around some more, shifted his feet, and said, "Hey, Mike, you haven't by any chance seen Daryl around, have you?" He paused. "I mean, like, today?" "You mean like in the 5 minutes I've been awake?" Beyond Toby's shoulder, the open front door gave a view to the street. Through spits of rain, Mike could see a black Lincoln Navigator with Minnesota plates parked at the curb in front of the house, blocking the driveway. To his left, he had an angle on the window overlooking the empty carport alongside the house. No skylark. Mike couldn't help wondering why they bothered blocking the driveway. Mike reminded himself that he didn't know this guy Bryce from a hole in the ground. Oh, sorry, I skipped over some stuff here. All right. This is, I guess my reading skills must be rusty. Okay, hang on. So, yeah, so Mike and Bryce have gotten in a little bit of a back and forth here, and I'll just skip to this part. Hey, okay, Toby jumped in. Let's just, right, Bryce, I got this. His eyes said, please? Bryce smirked. Whatever you say, boss. I'll give myself the tour. He brushed past Mike on his way into the house. His eyes said, stop me. Mike caught a glimpse of a shoulder holster under the bike jacket as Bryce passed. None of this seemed like a promising way to start a day. Sorry, Toby said when they were alone. Bryce has an intensity. I got that, Mike said. Where'd you find it? Works for my uncle, Toby shrugged. He's sort of on loan for the day. No kidding. Toby's uncle's a bail bondsman with billboards all over town. Television commercials, too. Late at night, it was hard to miss them. Real-life bounty hunter, huh? Fugitive recovery specialist, Toby said. He has business cards and everything. Neat. Why did he kick my door in? Toby sighed. Maybe we could sit for a minute? Sure, Mike said. As they arranged themselves like civil people, Mike could hear Bryce, the fugitive recovery specialist, moving room to room through the house, sweep searching. Mike did his best to let it go for now. He left the beat-up couch for Toby, took the beat-up recliner for himself, observing the state of the place as he picked his way through the mess. The coffee table and the floor all around the coffee table were littered with half-crumpled beer cans. Mike saw the Old Crow bottle from the kitchen cupboard, more than half full last he remembered, empty now. The ashtray, which he dumped yesterday, overflowed with butts. By the look of things, Darrell had kept right on drinking after they'd come in at .30 and parted company. That or he'd gotten an early start. Either way, he'd put some work into it. Let me guess, Mike said. You lost Darrell's cell number. Hey, I've been calling it, Toby said. Believe me, Mike, he hasn't been answering. What's so urgent? Finding Darrell at the moment. Feel free to elaborate. Toby leaned forward on the edge of the sofa cushion, elbows on his knees. He seemed unsure how to begin. Okay, he finally said. A couple hours ago, I get this call from one of my regulars, lunchtime or so. Nice guy, owns a steak and chops place on Nicolette, Chevalier. You ever been there? Can't say that I have. Serve a mad porterhouse, Toby said. Anyway, this guy, he's a good customer. Been on my sheet for, I don't know, 2-3 years. He wins, he loses, I let him ride, it evens out. He owns his place, but he's also the head chef. Works like a dog. He's at the restaurant all the time. So I send the guy to him every week. He's always ready with the commission, lays whatever he wants that week, on we go. No problems. Okay, less elaboration, Mike said. He couldn't listen to Toby while listening to the rest of the house with his other ear. He couldn't hear anything out of Toby's man, Bryce, and he didn't like the quiet. Haha, see? It happens every time. That's okay, I'm only teasing you. He couldn't hear anything out of Toby's man, Bryce, and he didn't like the quiet. The house wasn't exactly big enough to get lost in. Fast forward to lunch. Toby nodded. Like I said, my guy calls me. This is during his busy hour. He tells me that Darrell came by the restaurant this morning, regular time or so, early, when the place was empty. In other words, like normal? Well, that's the thing, Toby said. Normal, yes and no. Yes and no like how? Like, normally Darrell wouldn't take 8 hours to deliver me a collection, for starters. Jesus, Toby, you're kicking in doors now? I know, right? Toby said. I'm a numbers guy. You know I'm not cut out for this hardball stuff. That's why I used guys like Darrell in the first place. He gave a weak smile. I guess that's probably what they call irony, right? Mike yawned. He rubbed his face. His head felt cracked and his mouth tasted like a dry sewer line. He wanted a glass of water and a shower and his door fixed. I think you can relax. The Skylark's a hunk of junk. Maybe he just broke down somewhere and forgot to charge his phone. You know Darrell. Yeah, Toby said, that's part of the problem. He was quiet, then added, thing is, Mike, I sent a guy to Chevalier this week already. Oh, Monday morning. Mike thought he was finally getting the picture. Considering the rubble of empties between them on the coffee table, it wasn't difficult to imagine what must have happened. Only the night before, at the elbow room, a news reporter had to remind him that April was only a week old already, and compared to Darrell, Mike was organized. He said, so mistakes were made. You could say that, Toby said. If by mistakes you mean putting a gun up to my best customer's eye and pretty much flat out robbing him in broad daylight in his own place, then yeah, it sounds like definitely mistakes were made. Mike looked at him. Say that again? 11 o'clock this morning, my customer calls and tells me Daryl comes to his place around daybreak, pulls out a hand cannon, and tells him he'll shoot his face off if he doesn't settle his sheet. Toby's voice rose as he talked. And not just the weekly juice either, which, remember, he already paid. I mean the whole balance. Mike didn't know if he'd ever heard quite this tone out of Toby. Hand cannon? Juice? Even Toby seemed to hear how he sounded. He released a long breath. Apparently, my guy was in his office batching up tickets, he said. Most of what he would have owed me was stacked in cash on the desk, all ready to go to the bank. He said Daryl shoved a bag at him like a gym bag, told him to stuff it all in and just, walked out with it. That's what your guy told you? He was pretty rattled, Toby said. Took him all morning to pull himself together the way he tells it. Lucky thing he called me instead of the cops. Did you talk to him in person or only on the phone? Both, Toby said. Can't see any reason not to believe him, Mike. He's never lied to me before, as far as I know. Mike thought a minute. There's no way you and Daryl could have crossed wires, he said. He messed up the day, went in there with the wrong idea. I don't think so, but it's possible. Thing is, Mike, Daryl doesn't exactly work for me anymore. That didn't make sense. Doesn't exactly? Doesn't at all. Toby seemed to be sizing him up. I'm getting the impression you didn't know that. It's new information, Mike admitted. Since when? About a week ago, Toby said. He quit? Not so much quit. Mike got the impression that Toby wished he didn't have to be the one to explain. Mike, you know I like the guy, but lately, I don't know, man. It kind of seems like he's been coming unglued. How do you mean? Mike said, even though being maybe the closest thing to a friend Daryl Potter had left on planet Earth, he thought he knew well enough what Toby meant. Unglued was as good a way to put it as any. Getting rough on people, for one thing. A bookie's worried because one of his collectors is getting rough on people? Toby's cheeks flushed. More than need be. How much more? More enough, Toby said. Okay, my sheet, Mike, the regulars, they mostly always pay. I wouldn't keep taking their action if they didn't. Guns? Who am I, Tony Soprano? I'm a numbers guy. Mike tried to think. What came to him was a picture of Daryl in the passenger seat of the Buick 12 hours ago, sitting in the dome light with bloodshot eyes and a 1,000-yard stare, and all Mike could think was, what the hell have you started this time, you dumb grunt? And you know for a fact it was Daryl, he said, at the restaurant this morning. Not one of your other guys? I've only got one other guy, and he's answering his phone, Toby said. Besides, this customer's seen Daryl a time or two. If you didn't remember him before, he sure remembers him now. Bryce came back into the living room then, cracking his knuckles. No wonder this genius took your money, he said to Toby, scanning his surroundings. This place is a shithole. At the mention of money, it occurred to Mike to ask, how much was he into you, your restaurant guy? Toby shrugged. 10 grand or so? Jesus. This Final Four bracket didn't work out. Mike sat and thought about $10,000. Toby added, he told me Daryl walked out with more like 11. 11,000, yeah. Mike thought about $11,000. Look, Mike, I'm really sorry, Toby said. I know he's your boy and all, not exactly in my comfort zone here. By now, Mike was only half listening again. A bad feeling had crawled into his stomach and curled up there. Anyway, Toby stood. He produced a smartphone, looked at the screen a minute, tapped it a few times with his index finger, then put the phone back in the pocket of his windbreaker. If you see him, I guess, did you tell him to call me? Sure, Mike said. Toby seemed ready to say something else before deciding that there wasn't much else to say. He rejoined the muscle he'd borrowed from his uncle and headed for the door. As they let themselves out, Mike said, "Hey, Toby?" Toby looked back. You haven't heard from any of your other customers today, have you? Not so far, Toby said. Believe me, we've been checking. If you do, Mike said, would you let me know? Sure thing, Mike, thanks. And, sorry again about the door. Mike felt himself nod. See you around, the bounty hunter said. That's the first chapter of Lake Country, thank you. Where Daryl is and what Daryl is doing is the rest of Lake Country. So that's a little taste of the book that I came here to talk about. Writers always, this book came out a few years ago, 2013. Writers always like to read from their new stuff. So since we don't have a class that's read this book, I might go ahead and read from something else, something new that'll be coming out next year. This is the book that Bonnie mentioned in the intro. It's called Kill Monster. It's my new book. It's coming out on audio in January, and then in book form after that. I'm mostly known for suspense thrillers. Kill Monster is a little bit of a lot of different things that I love. I love monster movies. I love suspense. I love chase books, and I love this part of the country. My last several books have been set in or around where we live, which, believe it or not, is not the most common setting for novels out there. And I kind of made a shift at some point in my writing career. I think when I started, I set my books elsewhere because I thought elsewhere was more interesting. And as I got older as a person and as a writer, I realized where I live is pretty interesting, and it's a place that a lot of people out there on the coasts and elsewhere don't know a lot about. So I enjoy setting my novels here. Kill Monster is no exception. The seeds for Kill Monster came from a steamboat museum in Kansas City. I think there's one. There's also one near DeSoto that I have not been to, but I hear it's great. The one I've been to is the Steamboat Arabia Museum in Kansas City. So the premise of this museum is in the 1800s, steamboats paddled up and down the Missouri River, hauling cargo to and fro, and they tended to sink. A metaphor about these boats sinking that I really liked was that the paddle boats powered their paddles through steam ovens, boilers, and the fuel for the boilers came from the trees along the riverbank. They'd cut down the trees, use the wood to run the boilers that powered the ship up and down the river. Well, cutting the trees down along the riverbanks led to erosion, which caused the trees to fall into the water and then sink the boats. So I really enjoyed the idea that the fuel for the boat is also kind of the major danger for the boat. The other thing I really liked about the museum is this idea that the Missouri River changed course at one point, leaving some of these steamship wrecks buried under farmland. So these guys, at great personal expense and travail, dug up one of these things. It was called the Steamship Arabia. Everything on it was perfectly preserved in this mud. So it's a really beautiful snapshot of 1850 whatever. The cargo that was on this ship looks like it came right out of the general store in 1856. And I just found the whole place very evocative and very fascinating. One of the displays that really caught my eye was a display of Beecher's Bibles. Does anybody know what a Beecher's Bible is? Anybody ever heard the term Beecher's Bible? If you don't know, there was a minister on the East Coast named Henry Ward Beecher, and he was sympathetic to the Free Staters in the Midwest. He raised a lot of money. His church raised a lot of money for the Free Stater cause and the anti-slavery cause. He helped buy freedom for a lot of slaves. He helped, smuggle slaves through funding out of captivity. And one of the things that he raised money to ship to this part of the country, to the Kansas, what was then the Kansas Territory, were rifles, Sharps rifles, which at the time were the most fancy modern rifle they had. They were repeating rifles. That Henry Ward Beecher's church raised money to purchase and send to the resistance here on the plains. The crates that they shipped these rifles in, they labeled books or often Bibles to disguise what was actually inside the crates. And so these rifles became known as Beecher's Bibles. I love the idea of a steamship buried under a cornfield. I love the idea of this past time being preserved in this anaerobic mud where no oxygen or sunlight has penetrated for 100 years. And I love the idea of a gun-running preacher sending guns in crates marked Bibles. So that stuff all kind of like percolated in my mind for a while, and what I came up with was a book called Kill Monster, which I sort of think of as a 50s drive-in creature feature sort of a story, except it's in novel form. So having sort of probably talked for too long about the setup of this book, I'll just read you the beginning of this book. Called Kill Monster, and here it goes. Kill Monster. But first, the true story of the minister, the rabbi, the creature, the water carrier, and the wreck of the steamboat Arcadia. I took the steamboat Arabia, changed a couple of letters around, called it Steamboat Arcadia. Otherwise, go to the museum in Kansas City and you'll see the inspiration for this book. We are glad to know that the only life lost on this unfortunate occasion was that of a mule, which would have been saved but for its own obstinacy. The Daily Missouri Democrat, September 11, 1856. 1. Beecher and Lowe, Brooklyn, New York, summer 1856. 6 weeks after their first strange meeting, Beecher traveled by carriage to the far side of the city with a vial of blood from the western frontier. He arrived at a soot-blackened factory building an hour before sunset. He climbed the iron walk-up and knocked on a grimy steel door. When the rabbi answered, Beecher glanced once over his shoulder, then followed the smaller man inside. "It's authentic?" the rabbi asked, appraising Beecher's vial between his thumb and one crooked forefinger. "How can we know this?" "Because we didn't pay for it," Beecher said. "You make jokes." "To the contrary, I dare say." "If there can be the smallest doubt, realize, please, that I cannot proceed." Rabbi Lowe looked gravely at Beecher. "Will not proceed." Despite the theologically questionable business now at hand, Beecher found himself distracted by the shabbiness of the rabbi's living quarters, a meager watchman's apartment over a rope and cordage works on the East River. Lowe's rooms were dim and musty, sparsely furnished, crowded everywhere with books. Some of the books looked very old indeed. "Reverend Beecher, are you listening?" "A physician in the region is sympathetic to our cause," Beecher explained. When the rabbi seemed eager for further elaboration, he added, "The rest is a matter of some detail." "If your physician has access to this man Walcott, why can he not perform the task himself?" "Our physician may be a spy, but he's still a sworn healer. That means he's bound by oath to assassinate people only by accident." Beecher sighed. "It's also my understanding that he himself is now dead." The rabbi closed his eyes as he lowered the specimen, in the same motion concealing the vial in his palm. Beecher imagined an arthritic magician preparing a trick. Not far from the truth, perhaps. "And if you'll forgive the reminder, Rabbi Lowe," he went on, "it was you who first approached me." "So it was." "When shall I return, then?" The rabbi straightened his shoulders. At full height, he almost reached Beecher's chin. 3 days, with one of your boxes." "Very well. And now, will you stay for wine?" "Thank you," Beecher said, "but I believe that temperance remains one of the cardinal virtues." At this, Rabbi Lowe laughed, a high, gimlet cackle that startled Beecher mildly. The rabbi carried on laughing as Beecher showed himself out, leaving the steel door open behind him. Beecher could still hear the sound of the man's voice as he descended the iron stairs, a crow-like rasp somewhere over his head, drifting out toward the bay. 3 days later, Beecher returned to the rope factory as instructed, this time in a wagon under cover of night. With him, he bore an empty shipping crate marked books. For more than 2 years, Beecher, with the help of his congregation, along with other moneyed allies, had been sending such crates 1,500 miles west to the Free Staters in the Kansas Territory. Though Beecher's crates were always marked books, or tools, or sometimes even Bibles, they always contained the same cargo: guns. Sharp's carbine rifles, to be precise. Breech-loading, self-priming wonderments of modern accuracy and power. Just the tool to help give those right-minded jayhawkers a leg up against the slave-mongering heathens from bordering Missouri. You might just as well read the Bible to buffaloes, Beecher had been quoted as saying, as to those fellows who follow Atchison and Stringfellow. And they have a supreme respect, but they have a supreme respect for the logic that is embodied in Sharp's rifle. Among the many obstacles now facing the cause was that Beecher had, in fact, been quoted as saying so, in Greeley's Tribune, no less. Whether for this reason alone or by some otherwise unlucky combination of circumstance and treachery, Beecher's past 3 shipments had been intercepted en route to their destination. 2 months ago, the so-called border ruffians, led by the godless savage William Bloody Bill Walcott, had finally sacked the abolitionist township of Lawrence. According to dispatches, Bloody Bill and his gang carried on wreaking havoc about the countryside even now. The pendulum, it seemed, had swung toward the enemy, and far in the distance, Kansas lay bleeding. Then came Rabbi Zalman Lowe to Beecher's door. Beecher was given to understand that the rabbi had been ousted from his own temple sometime previously. The 2 men had not discussed such details upon that first meeting, nor did they discuss such details now, 6 weeks and 3 days later, standing together in a dank hold of the rope works, surrounded by bales of coir and sisal hemp. The room smelt to Beecher of burlap and wet iron, with perhaps the faintest rotten egg tinge of sulfur somewhere beneath. Reverend Beecher, Lowe said, I would introduce you to Silas Wasserman. The young bearded man at Lowe's side stepped forward, extending his hand in greeting. He wore Orthodox garb, side locks tucked behind his ears. Reverend Beecher, he said, I am Silas Wasserman. It means water carrier, Lowe added. Rep Wasserman will accompany our cargo to the frontier. Beecher found Silas Wasserman's grip soft and somewhat clammy despite the lingering heat of the day, but he nodded to the younger man with sincerity. For carrying our water, then, consider me your personal debtor. Wasserman stepped back, folded his hands before him, and turned his eyes respectfully to the floor. Beecher said, and our cargo? The rabbi offered a smile Beecher couldn't interpret. Without further preamble, he shifted his gaze toward the dim reaches of the warehouse and spoke a phrase in Hebrew, Bo Hana. At Lowe's command, a 4th man emerged from the shadows, a hulking figure, intimidating even from afar. As this 4th man shambled toward them, Beecher found himself transfixed by the giant stranger's brutish, menacing silhouette. Motes of dust swirled in the air as the figure crossed a beam of moonlight. In that fleeting, silvery moment, Beecher thought, not a man. Crude, lumpen, faceless, only just man-like enough in its shape, in its horrid, burdensome lurch, to be revealed for what it was, an abomination, a blasphemy. The golem, Rabbi Zalman Lowe said. Merciful Jesus, the rabbi's eyes twinkled. Reb Wasserman, we have a new believer in our midst. Lowe's creature was almost upon them now. Each approaching footfall sounded like a heavy sack of wet mixed cement landing upon the ground. Beecher could feel each muted impact through the concrete beneath his feet. He was nearly overtaken by a sudden feathery lightness in his chest. He tried to call out, but his mouth had gone dry. A word of advice, Reverend, Lowe said. In your place, I would stand aside. Beecher stood aside. A radiant chill touched his skin as the creature passed him by. From this distance, Beecher could see lumps, depressions, and finger marks in the thing's otherwise featureless visage. It was like a small child's notion of a human adult, sculpted from a life-sized block of clay. In heaven's name, he croaked, what is that smell? Nothing of heaven, the rabbi answered. You smell accursed earth, mined from the valley of Hinnom by my own mentor's hand. The creature lumbered to a halt at the open crate marked books. There it waited, motionless, a cane's reach away, a silent, soulless thing. Lowe placed a hand on Silas Wasserman's shoulder. Wasserman, the water carrier, drew from his pocket a pair of smooth emerald green stones. With what Beecher interpreted to be trepidation, the young man approached the creature. Rising up onto the tips of his toes, he pressed the stones into the moist clay one at a time, endowing the inscrutable giant with a primitive semblance of eyes. Then he drew a hitching breath, cleared his throat, and said, Numa. Like a barrel-bodied man stepping into a bath, Lowe's golem climbed into its crate and sat down. Then it reclined, slowly, incredibly, molding itself to the dimensions of the space as it settled. The emerald green stones receded into the thing, disappearing from view. Within moments, any observer might have mistaken the crate for what it appeared simply to be, a box filled to the lip with slick, mud-streaked clay. Beecher whispered the first word that bobbed to the surface of his mind. How? How indeed? Lowe shrugged. Ancient teachings, some of this, bits of that, and, of course, he held up the blood vial, now empty, cloudy with rust-colored residue. This. Beecher opened his mouth to respond, then he closed it again. No further words presented themselves. As Silas Wasserman set about fixing the lid onto the crate with a hammer and a fistful of 10-penny nails, Lowe said, "When the box next opens, the golem will awake. It carries out its purpose, to find the man whose blood it shares. Only when that man is destroyed shall the creature return to the soil." With effort, Beecher wrenched his gaze from the crate and looked upon his odd little partner. He tried to gather his thoughts as Wasserman carried on hammering in the background. He finally said, "And then? And then? What and then?" Lowe raised his gnarled fists to ear level and shook them in forecasted triumph. "Then we make one for Atchison, and another for Stringfellow. Ha! May God forgive us. May God reward us." Rabbi Lowe unballed his fists and spread his hands. "While we're waiting, shall we see about that wine?" I was going to read more, but I could feel time sort of crawling along there, so I'll leave it there. But so instead of a crate full of guns, in my story, they send this creature from Jewish legend called a golem to the Midwest. Well, the boat sinks. The golem gets buried under a cornfield to be dug up 150 years later. The guerrilla general is long dead, but his only surviving descendant is kind of a dummy middle-aged guy like me working in a IT department of a company in Omaha, and now he's got a monster after him. That's Kill. That will be Kill Monster in January. So anyway, that'll be enough reading for, I think, today. I'll just open it up if anybody has any questions or anything they want to talk about or ask or accuse me of, feel free. And if not, we can get out of class early.
So that's going to be on Audible. Are you going to be narrating it?
No, they've hired a proper voice actor to narrate it. But Audible has a new line they're calling Audible Originals, which are they're like, you know how some movies go straight to video? This is kind of like books going straight to audio. It's audio is a big sort of thriving part of the book market right now, and different people are trying different things. And so I'm gonna try this with this book. Audible's gonna release it as an exclusive audio book in January, and then I think they have like a 6-month window or something, and then after that there'll be a print version that appears first in the UK, and then I think about this time next year it'll be out here in the States.
Once you have an idea for your book, do you then lay out an outline of stories then to ghostwrite what you're going to write?
So it's a question, do I outline these stories? I tell you, I'm a terrible outliner. For me, the act of writing fiction is also the act of creating the fiction. It's kind of an act of discovery a lot of times. I sort of have to write my way into the story. Now, having said that, I did a project. I don't know if the term ghostwriting means anything to people in the room, but ghostwriting is when like a celebrity or somebody with a name wants to write a book, but they don't want to write it themselves. They hire somebody to write it, and then they put their name on it. So I was a ghostwriter on a project that really required an extensive outline, and boy, that sure made writing it easier. So I'm always trying to develop my skills as an outliner, because it really helps hammer out the framework of a story, and it helps you know what you're doing every day when you sit down at the computer. But the way my brain works, I seem to have real trouble thinking of what the story is going to be before I actually write it. So I'm kind of I'm attempting to become a better outliner, but for the most part, I don't outline very well. I usually start with a basic idea. I might have some ideas for some stuff that happens along the way. Maybe I have an idea for a midpoint. Maybe I have a general idea of how I want it to end. That always changes during the writing, but it's something to start with. And I'll kind of outline 2 or 3 chapters ahead of where I'm at, just to try to keep some momentum going forward. But I do tend to get stuck a lot. I tend to be a slower writer than some of my peers for that reason. So I would like to learn how to outline better.
Are you often surprised at the ending of a book?
Often.
You're not outlining, you don't have an idea.
I'm often surprised. And what surprises me most is, you kind of start out with a general idea of what you want the book to be, like kind of what you're going for. It might be a sort of a nebulous idea, but you have this sense of what you're trying to accomplish. And then things change along the way, and you start to panic because it feels like the book's getting away from you and it's becoming something else. And then you fight that for a while, or at least I do, and finally you give in and just let the book be what it wants to be. And by the time it's all done, it's completely different than what you imagined, and yet it's still sort of what you set out to do in the first place. I find that process very mysterious and kind of rewarding. That's really the reward of writing for me, is to see how that stuff comes out of you.
Do you have a daily writing routine?
Yes, and no. I used to work really late at night, every day without fail. I would get started around after everybody in my household was asleep. That's when my writing day would start, and I would write from about 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. pretty much without fail every day. And then I kept getting older, and my brain kept getting older, and now I'm no good for anything at 2 in the morning. So I'm trying to learn how to rewire myself to work in the mornings. And when I'm working on a project, I do have a very strict routine of getting up every day and making the donuts, so to speak, before I go off to. I still have a regular day job where I go work in an office from 8 to 5. So and I'm a father with a couple of kids, and so life is busy, just like it is for everybody. And it becomes a matter of really stealing the time that I can. So when I'm working on a book now, it's very important to, if I have time in the morning, if I have time, in the early evening when I'm still somewhat fresh, I got to make sure I clock in at those times every day. Having said that, I tend to, nowadays, I seem to take a long time between books. So there'll be a period of, rest and recuperation between projects where I'm really not writing much of anything at all. And in between projects, I'm a terribly undisciplined writer, but when I'm working, I tend to be pretty disciplined about it. Yeah.
How long do you spend writing per day?
How long do I spend writing per day?
Yeah.
That really tends to vary, and that's also changed as I've gotten older. I don't think in terms of time as much as I tend to track it in words. And if I'm working on a novel, during the week, I feel like if I can get 500 words a day, that's a good goal for me. It's not much. It's only a couple of pages of manuscript. But if I can clock 500 words every day during the week, and then maybe get 1,000 or 1,500 on the weekends, over time those words add up, and in a month you got 20,000, 30,000 words, and the next month, it just keeps adding up. But I tend to go for about 500 words a day. When I was younger, I produce a lot more than that, but now, it sounds a little silly to be pages a day. That doesn't seem like much, but it's, thinking it up is heavier work than it seems like, and so that seems to be about where I'm comfortable now. It's a good amount to you're making progress each day, but you're not burning yourself out each day, leaving a little bit in the gas tank for the next day. I have found that when I push too hard and I empty myself out too much, it's like trying to start a car with no gas in it, kind of, you know. And so as I've gotten to be a middle-aged person, energy conservation has become as important to the writing process as the writing itself. So 500 words a day is kind of what I try to hit.
Have you tried other genres besides like thriller?
I started out, when I first started, I was a big Stephen King fan growing up, and so I started writing horror stories. And I kind of shifted from that into crime and suspense. And on the side, I have done other types of projects. I've done literary short stories, or what you might call more literary. I've done other types of writing projects, like screenplays, and even a little bit of like comic book type stuff. That was one of the fun things about Kill Monster for me, was bringing that early love of horror and monsters and stuff, and then the skills that I developed as a suspense writer, and kind of mashing those two things together. It kind of felt like just getting to do everything that I like at once. But yeah, I mean, and if something came along, if a project came along, I don't only like crime suspense fiction. In fact, anymore, it's probably the least of what I read. I mean, I tend to read in other genres, and then that leads me to kind of other types of ideas as well. So
what do you like to read? What are you currently reading? What types of stuff?
I like to read every kind of thing, really. Right now, it's October, and I kind of get a little nostalgic for that old horror stuff in October, so I'm reading a couple of, I got a couple of books on my Kindle over there right now. One of them is called Sandman Slim by a guy named Richard Kadri, if anybody's heard it. It's kind of apparently it's a series that's been going on for a while. I've never read it before, but Sandman Slim is one that I'm reading right now. But I just finished reading, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the title now. Donna Tartt. Do people know the writer Donna Tartt?
Goldfinch.
The Goldfinch, that's right. Well, do you remember the name of her book before the...
Oh, I didn't know she had done it.
Yeah, she won the Pulitzer Prize for a previous book, or maybe she won it for the Goldfinch, I don't know. But Donna Finch's previous novel, which is a very dense, very literary, very like prose, writerly, beautiful, thick, dense book, and it's my favorite thing that I've read this year, probably. Oh, gosh, I'm blanking on the title now, but I'll remember it before we're done, hopefully.
How did you get your agent?
Well, in my case, so do you have some experience trying to get an agent, or are you just curious?
Not much, just curious.
Generally, the process for getting an agent is you write what's called a query letter, which is, this is who I am, this is what my book is about, will you represent me to publishers? And then they say yes or no. That can be a long, slow, demoralizing process, because agents, any good agent, two things are true about any good agent. They have too many writers on their list already, and they're always looking for the next new thing that they think they can sell. So that makes them very selective, and it makes your odds of rejection very high. So finding an agent oftentimes is a sort of a long process of querying, sending your manuscript to people, and waiting for the response. I had an agent very early on that the relationship just sort of, she was not able to sell the book that she was representing, and then she left book publishing altogether to go work for the movies. So then I did not have an agent again for a number of years, and I couldn't get an agent to save my life. I finally sold my first novel, which is called Dirt, to a small press by myself. For large publishers like the Random Houses and the the Simon & Schusters of the world, you really need an agent to get into those places and even get an audience there. But smaller presses, you are often open to what they call unsolicited submissions, meaning it's not represented by an agent pretty much. So I sold my first book to a small press that specialized in crime fiction. We developed a good relationship, and I stayed with them for my second book. And over the course of 2 books, I was fortunate to receive some good reviews here and there. Started attracting just a tiny little bit of notice in some circles, which led to a publisher offering to reprint my second novel as a paperback. It was released by the small press as a hardcover. Random House came and offered to reprint that book as a paperback. But what I found is that it's a lot easier to get an agent when you already have a deal, which is sort of a catch-22. You know, you can't get an agent without a deal, but you can't get a deal without an agent. So I was fortunate in that sense to have some good luck that I could then parlay into a relationship with an agent that I've now been with for, I guess, 15 years or so. But that's how it happened for me. Well, we're creeping up on 5 o'clock here. If anybody has any last questions they'd like to ask or comments they'd like to make, please feel free.
Did you have to do like any research on any of your novels and stuff?
I do tend to have to do some research. Depends on the story, of course. My third novel, called The Cleanup, is the main character is a police officer. And he works in a police station. I'm not a police officer. I don't have any police officers in my family, so I tried to set out to kind of learn a little bit about that job. I did some ride-alongs with the Omaha police, and did a lot of reading and research, about law enforcement, for example. A couple of books later, one of the characters from Lake Country first appeared in the book that came before Lake Country. It's called Safer. She's a television news reporter. Again, don't have any experience with TV news, so I spent a day at Channel 7 in Omaha just kind of following reporters around on stories and just kind of getting a feel for what that job is like. And then, of course, there's just like book-based research that I do for Kill Monster, for example. There are sections of the book that are set in a historical setting. They're set 150 years ago, so I did a fair amount of research about trying to get that time period sort of somewhat accurate sounding. I tend to try to keep research too. Sometimes I will read a book that has obviously been extensively researched, and the research almost gets in the way of the story just a little bit. I try to not let that happen. I try to keep the research. I try to let the research add flavor and a sort of sense of reality to the story, but I never want all my awesome research that I did to get in the way of the story itself. But now, research has changed so much over the last, I would say, 10 years. When I was first writing novels, it was so much harder to access information than it is now. Now, I can research, I don't know, London, let's say, as a setting without ever going to London, because I can go to Google Maps and I can type a street address in and get an actual satellite image of the street corner that I want to write about. It's the internet, for all its faults, the internet has made novel research much simpler than it used to be. Yeah.
So did you, for Lake Country, did you go to St. Paul to research the area?
There is a wonderful specialty bookstore in Minneapolis called Once Upon a Crime. And I've gone there often on book tours and things. When I was kind of developing the story for Lake Country, I would take advantage of those promotional trips to the Twin Cities to really kind of poke around and, get a sense of things. And I needed for this particular plot, I needed the characters to be able to kidnap somebody and take them somewhere that was very secluded and kind of hard to get to, but not not super far away from an urban area. I needed to be accessible within a couple of hours, but still very secluded. And Minnesota's central Minnesota lake country it was a perfect setting for that. So that's why I decided to set the book up there, really for geographical reasons as much as anything.
Does research with dialogue, do you do a lot of research with dialogue as far as this last novel you're writing, set in middle of the 1800s? The language has changed quite a bit since then. Do you pay attention to that, or do you make it more reader friendly and just stick with what we have today?
I would say that I researched that kind of thing sort of accidentally, in just the sense of really trying to absorb everything I can about what I am researching, and I think you just sort of naturally pick up and I definitely felt the cadence of my writing changing in those historical sections. The modern parts of the book have a kind of a quicker, more irreverent tone, and the 1850s stuff has a little bit more of a formalized kind of cadence to it. And I don't recall specifically researching language, but I certainly try to absorb everything I can from. That's another thing, like being around, like if you're researching a profession, cops talk a certain way. They have a certain rhythm to their voice, a certain way they say things. TV reporters have a certain way they talk about things, and it's always very useful to just kind of be a fly on the wall and hear people talking back and forth to each other. And I try to capture it to the best of my ability, but I don't think I specifically set out to research the language in that way.
Do you have a list of possible things to write about next? Are you always working on that list?
Yeah, and I do have I just call it my idea file, and I add to it all the time. I particularly like Sunday morning. My kind of routine on Sunday morning, assuming we don't have something that I have to be doing, is to just sit down with the newspaper and my laptop, and I read the New York Times and the Omaha paper on Sunday morning, and often reading through the newspaper, little things that jump out that seem interesting, and I'll just open my laptop and add a little line of something to my idea file. Sometimes they're just little nuggets that really don't have anything attached to them, but the best thing about the idea file for me is going back to it after some time passes and reading through all of these things that I've thrown in there over time, and stuff that didn't seem to capture my attention before suddenly does now, or something that I liked before, I suddenly see it from a different angle now. Like ideas that I may think I had discarded suddenly come back and have a sort of a new currency 5 years down the road. So I kind of, the idea file becomes almost like a weird diary of what things interest me at different times in my life. Do you do that? Do you keep up?
I do.
Yeah.
But the way I'm hearing you speak, it almost sounds a bit like a calendar as well. So if you decide that you're going to write about this idea located in about this area, you can go back at your diary and see what else was going on to like, add to the story, I'm sure.
The little stuff that I wrote about the Steamboat Museum after I came back, what else could they put in one of these crates? Mud, all the stuff buried in mud, I just thought Gollum, and then I just blurted it all out in my file. That goes back like 3 or 4 years ago. I was surprised at how far back in the file it was. Now, I'll ask you a question. Do you use the ideas in your idea file? Like,
yes and no. They usually trigger some other idea, which is where I go with it.
Well, I feel like what I find is that the ideas that grab me the most and sort of won't go away, I didn't need the file for in the first place because they stay in my brain. The ones that you forget maybe are worth forgetting sometimes, and the ones that stick are going to stick whether you write them down or not. I find that a lot of times my idea file, I don't know, it's just kind of like it's just kind of a garden that I tend, but I don't always harvest anything out of it.
That's pretty good.
Well, we're 5 after 5. We can shut it down unless anybody has a last comment or question. Thank you very much for turning up and having me.